As a young, healthy individual, I have been legitimately asked if I am having a stroke a lot of times. It's kind of sad. I would be willing to bet that this specific type of neurodevelopmental difference is largely responsible for the autistic experience, but someone with a similar genotype as me might have the traits combined in a way that causes them to be diagnosed with OCD or a tic disorder or ADHD. Hi, I'm Leanne, the ADHD PA. Today I'm sharing this self-reported scale I created in order to explain how I visualize the spectrum as an actually autistic medical professional. I discovered I'm autistic in October of 2021 when I was just 1 month shy of 31 years old, and the revelation was absolutely life-changing in the best way possible. Since discovering that I'm autistic, implementing a neurodiversity-affirming perspective into my clinical practice has been an all-consuming passion of mine. I've seen this approach make a really positive impact with my patients, and I wanted to be able to share it on a wider scale. So here I am on YouTube. First, I'll introduce the neurodiversity paradigm and one of my perhaps controversial opinions on how autism fits in there. Then I'll take you through how I think the spectrum should be conceptualized, why I created my scale the way that I did, and what this scale is meant to represent. After that, I'll go through the official diagnostic criteria of autism and how I use my scale to visually represent my particular flavor of neurodivergence. And finally, I'll leave you off with another one of my possibly controversial theories about the spectrum, which is a perspective that I've found to be quite helpful for many of my patients who deal with a fairly different set of chronic issues. This is my rendition of an image that I've seen in a few different places, and I really like the way that it presents the topic of neurodivergence. Usually the title is something like the Neurodivergent Umbrella, but I titled this one Neurodevelopmental Spectrum Differences because that's the terminology I personally like to use when I explain my perspective on this subject. It's actually not terminology I've seen before, but honestly, I would love it if the next iteration of the DSM changed a lot of things, but specifically I feel like the use of spectrum should be transitioned away from specific conditions and rather applied as an umbrella term to encompass all neurodevelopmental differences. Then we could use these already defined profiles to help elucidate which collections of traits, behavior patterns, or preferences have developed differently from what's most commonly seen in society, and how we can best understand, accept, and support those differences. As a proudly autistic person, I feel like using the phrase on the spectrum as solely referencing the autistic experience is way too narrow of a focus and potentially misleading, because the reality is that so many of the differences that combine to create the autistic experience are actually not unique to autism, but rather they overlap tremendously with numerous other neurodivergent conditions. If you're familiar with genetics, I'd equate this to the differences we see in the genotype and phenotype of any given trait. The genotype refers to the actual genetic code, or what's going on internally, and the phenotype refers to the way the trait presents externally. One of the really interesting aspects of studying this subject is that what you see in the genetic code is not always going to predict what is presented externally, particularly when there are multiple genes that influence a trait. For instance, it's commonly thought that two parents who have blue eyes would not be able to give birth to a brown-eyed child, but that's actually not the case because there are 16 different genes that go into making up the eye color, and you get half from one parent and half from the other, and they get spliced up and mixed together, and then there's so many ways all those genes can interact that while it's a rare occurrence, two blue-eyed people can have a brown-eyed child. And I think that this is what happens with neurodiversity, which may help explain why there has been such a massive surge in the recognition and late diagnosis of autism and ADHD in so many adults over the past few years. I think that we're just getting way better at understanding the various phenotypic expressions of these neurodivergent genotypes. Before we get further into it, I just wanted to note that in an attempt to destigmatize neurodivergence, I will be avoiding pejorative and pathologizing language as much as I can. There will be a few instances where I do use the terms that are conventional phrasing, and I'll try to use quotations to denote those, but for the most part, I'll be using my preferred terms. So a disorder or a deficit will become a difference or difficulty, symptoms become traits, sensitive or reactive becomes responsive, and unusual or abnormal becomes unexpected. With regard to normal, I will use terms like average, typical, or most common when describing trait presentations to indicate whatever is the most frequently seen in society as a whole. But I wanted to clarify in advance that I will be using the term normal quite a bit in the statistical sense as well. And for statistical data analysis, it is used much differently, and it's not really a negative connotation in that case. It's more of just a name. So I'll explain that more on the next slide. And then finally, I have the person-first terminology of a person with autism versus identity-first terminology of autistic person. And this identity-first option is my personal preference, and that seems to be fairly common within the autistic community nowadays. But I just wanted to point out that there are many people who still prefer the person-first phrasing, so it's always best to ask if you're unsure. Okay, bear with me here. I'm not going to get too heavy into the math behind all of this and start quizzing you on standard deviations or anything like that, but there are a few statistical concepts I want to point out before we dive deeper. If you've ever taken any sort of statistics, you'll recall this ever-present normal distribution bell curve. Normal in this sense is just the name of the type of distribution, so I do use it as indicated throughout the video. There are four main concepts I want to review here. The first is that variability refers to the various differences among presentations that you'll discover in anything you decide to measure. There are a few different ways that we measure variability, but the primary ones we're looking at today are the range and distribution. So second, the range refers to how much space is in between the upper and lower limits of your measured data points. And third, the distribution refers to the concentration of data points in any given area within that range, which could show up as skewed if the data are spread out unevenly, or if the data are evenly distributed like they are here, where the curve is relatively symmetric and the highest number of data points fall right around the middle. That's what's considered a normal distribution, and in that case, we expect to see about 70% of the data points in that central range, and the remaining 30% would be split evenly and stretch out relatively symmetrically on both sides. And finally, number 4 is that if you have a large enough sample size, you are going to see a normal distribution of the data points that you measure. And this is actually what we're looking for when performing research, because a normal distribution indicates that you've got a good amount of variability in your sample. You're more likely to find valid results with your study, and then your conclusions can more confidently be generalized to whatever population your sample is supposed to represent. So building off of that, if we think of this as a spectrum of neurodevelopmental diversity, and we're looking at the way any given trait will be expressed in the entire population, we're going to expect to see a normal distribution of presentations, where that central 70% would represent the most common or neurotypical presentations, and then about 15% would land above and below that central range, making up the various neurodivergent presentations. The key point to understand here is that the further away from neurotypical a trait presents, the more likely it is that the person is going to be deemed either gifted or disordered, or sometimes both. But statistically, it just means that their presentation is on the outer limits of what we would expect to see, assuming there's a normal distribution across the population. Using that framework, having a neurodivergent trait is every bit as normal as having a neurotypical trait. It's just seen less frequently. I wanted to note that I adapted this figure from the Scotland National Autism Implementation Team's 2022 editorial article on neurodevelopmental disorders and neurodiversity definitions. Over here on the right, I just listed a couple stats from the CDC. The oldest autism surveillance data that they have listed is from 2000, and at that time, only 1 in 150 school-aged children were identified as autistic, or less than 1% of the population. As of the latest surveillance data, which is from 2020, 1 in 36 children were identified as autistic, or nearly 3% of the population. I don't think that this means that there are suddenly way more cases of autism. I just think it means that we're getting way better at recognizing the patterns of the neurodivergence. I've seen a variety of sources estimate that around 15 to 20% of the total population has some form of neurodevelopmental disability, and I feel like that makes a lot of sense when you're looking at who we label as disordered. It's the people whose presentations fall furthest from the center. So 20% would mean that the top and bottom 10% of presentations are the ones that are going to be labeled as disordered, and therefore those people are most likely to experience disability. Using this model, I actually think that we could extrapolate from that and say that the prevalence of neurodivergence is probably closer to 30% of the total population, which again would be based on the assumption that the presentations will be normally distributed across the entire population of humans. On this next slide, I'm going to go over a few examples of how a given trait presentation will be variable even within one person, because I think it's very unlikely that a single trait will be expressed exactly the same way every single time it shows up. I know that's definitely not the case for me. The red curve denotes a possible distribution of a trait's presentation, and that's overlapping the expected population distribution that we saw before. I did make these curves smaller with the ranges more narrow than the typical population because I believe that you'll generally see less variability in a single person than in the whole population. This first curve shows a normal distribution, and the range is my guess as to what a typical range may be for an individual, although I realize I could be way off there, but for the sake of the video, let's just go with that. The curve is directly overlapping the neurotypical limits of the population, so this would be an example of a neurotypical presentation. With this second curve, the range is a similar width to the last one, but the distribution is more skewed to one side, and the majority of the curve is situated outside of the neurotypical limits, and it only overlaps partially. So this particular curve would represent a neurodivergent presentation. But if the curve were moved slightly over to the left so that the majority does overlap the neurotypical limits, then it would represent a neurotypical presentation. Side note, I have gifted written in the conventional style over here on the left because I have mixed feelings about that label since it can come off as derogatory in certain situations. But I guess it depends on whatever context it's being used in, and I don't know. I'm undecided. The third curve I have here is positioned well outside the population's neurotypical limits, and the range is far more narrow than the last two curves that we saw. That said, the curve is pretty close to being symmetrical, so I would say that this is a relatively normal distribution. I think that these are the presentations that are the most likely to be labeled as a disorder or to cause someone to feel disabled because the way society was built was not equipped to accommodate their norm. Okay, this last curve I've drawn might look a little outlandish, but I do think there are certain situations where traits will present like this with the majority of the data points falling outside of the neurotypical limits at both ends of the spectrum. I definitely experienced this myself with certain traits, and I've seen it with others as well. I wanted to point out that I think that when people have this type of distribution with things like emotional affect or sensory differences, they're much more likely to be labeled as having a personality disorder, or people may erroneously refer to these types of swings as bipolar disorder, but that's actually not what constitutes a bipolar diagnosis at all. So this is the scale that I developed to explain the spectrum. For this video, I've positioned my sliders to represent my most common state, but I did make this tool with the idea that I could move the slider up and down at any given point to indicate to my husband where I'm currently at. So if, say, I was having a really hard time speaking at the moment, I could move my language production slider way down and he wouldn't be as confused by my sudden switch to one-word answers or grunting, because that's what happens. And it's usually not his fault, usually. It's just that for whatever reason, I can't speak right now. So sorry. And that pretty much happens daily for me. The red arrow calipers at either end indicate my typical range. And while it's definitely possible for me to force myself outside of that range, that's what we call masking, and it is exhausting to maintain. It contributes to a lot of anxiety and irritability and all sorts of negativity. So, even though I can do it, I don't like it and I don't want to. So I would say that's one of the best things about figuring out that I'm autistic is that I no longer feel responsible for maintaining masking because I am deserving of accommodations just like everyone else. And just because 70% of the population expects me to fit in with them doesn't mean that I have to maintain their standards. The positive 100 to negative 100 numbers on the left are just arbitrary labels that could be replaced with any other measurement indicator. I just have them here like this to indicate that the middle point or 0 would be whatever the most common or average presentation is, and then the top and bottom would be whatever extremes are furthest away from that average. And then I have this pattern section in the middle to highlight the neurotypical range where we expect to see 70% of the population's presentations to fall. So I wanted to emphasize that this is a self-reported scale, and I have just picked out variables and selected where I think I fall with each one of them in an attempt to represent my experience to the best of my ability. I have done my best to be as objective as autistically possible, but I realize that I most certainly could be wrong, and I'm not trying to say that this is the end-all be-all and that the variables I picked out and the labels I've given them are absolutely correct. I would love to hear your thoughts on how to go about defining all of these variables and figuring out where a person's range and sliders would fall, but I had to create this and get it out here first. So now here it is, and we can build off of it. That said, I do think that it would be totally possible to apply validated screening and measurement tools to this reporting style in order to make it a little less subjective. I personally think that that would make for a really neat research project. So this is just to show how I imagine my scale to line up with that normal distribution curve that we talked about before. For the rest of the video, if the slider is fairly centralized between the two calipers, it suggests that I believe my personal distribution is pretty normal for that trait. But if the slider is far closer to one side than the other, then that means I feel like my distribution is fairly skewed for that trait. This is what my scale looks like for some of the core traits that are implicated in the autistic profile. There's a saying in the autistic community that goes, if you've met one autistic person, then you've only met one autistic person. And I think that regardless of whether or not you agree with my position on adapting the spectrum terminology to encompass all different types of neurodevelopmental differences, the point of this scale is to exemplify how we are looking at a collection of neurodevelopmental traits for each person, and each trait would be represented by its own panel and have a range of presentations that may be expressed differently depending on a variety of circumstances. That means that the spectrum is not a linear continuum from high functioning to low functioning or more autistic to less autistic, but rather a multidimensional continuum of infinite potential combinations. Before I dive deeper into what these autistic traits mean, I just first wanted to touch on a few factors that I believe are more generalized neurodevelopmental differences, because I feel like these help explain why my genotype and phenotype combined in such a way that I meet the diagnostic criteria for autism, but someone with a similar genotype as me might have the traits combined in a way that causes them to be diagnosed with OCD or a tic disorder or ADHD. And I love the rainbow, but I know that's a lot of visual stimuli, so I switched it to a monochromatic spectrum for the rest of the slides so that we can focus more on the other content. This slide is reviewing my sensory differences, and please note that each of these sections are dramatically simplified for the purpose of this video, and they could be broken out into numerous subcategories. For now, I wanted to point out these broad categories and explain the meaning of all of the labels. I included 5 of our major senses here, but instead of taste, I included interoception, which I'll go over in a minute. Each of these 5 senses has 2 panels, sensation and perception. Sensation is the ability to simply recognize that there is some sort of stimulus that you're presented with. And then perception is the more complex process whereby the brain decodes that information in order to comprehend what it is, why it's happening, and how to respond to it. I wanted to point out a couple key points. Auditory and olfactory, or hearing and smell, are 2 of the most problematic, and I'll even say disabling sensory processes that I deal with. I perceive a lot in both of these categories, and the amount of information that comes in is often very overwhelming for me to manage. Particularly with auditory, because I deal with delayed processing or difficulty with perception, so it's very confusing and difficult for me to decode sounds, especially when it requires multiple complex interactions between different areas of the brain, such as comprehending language and using that information to develop a response. Whereas olfactory or smell, I typically can accommodate for that on my own a little bit better because I can avoid smells a little bit more easily than I can avoid sound. Visual is basically the opposite. I prefer visual stimuli over any other option. I will say that there are definitely times where I'm overwhelmed by certain visual stimuli, like really bright flashing lights or being outside without sunglasses, but overall it's a positive experience. So I would much rather be given something to read or a picture or a video to watch than have someone relay information to me verbally. If I can't see it, either tangibly or through visualization, I will not understand it. Tactile goes the other way. I generally have excellent sensory capacity, but my perception or processing speed of touch is all over the place. I have the slider set pretty low on the scale because uninvited touch is extremely distressing to me, such as a single hair caught on me somewhere, or tags on my clothing rubbing against my skin, or light touch from other people, or sweat. And I'm just predicting that part of the reason I struggle with those sensations so much is that perhaps my brain doesn't quite understand and dismiss inconsequential information, at least not as quickly as I would like it to. Okay, and the last 2 panels here are looking at interoception, and to me, this is one of the most fascinating topics within the neurodivergent realm. Interoception is the brain's ability to sense internal body signals such as hunger, thirst, or the need to use the restroom, and then process that information and respond accordingly. And mine sucks a lot. This is something that I've only really been delving into learning about over the past year, but I've decided that I really need to get in with an occupational therapist to help me develop better connections there. Okay, and here I have one more generalized neurodevelopmental differences slide, this one focusing more on the cognitive side of things. This first section I have labeled learning style bias, and I only have 4 panels here, but just know that this is also very simplified and there are numerous ways of breaking down the methods of learning. From my research, it looks like the 3 most commonly cited learning styles are auditory, visual, and tactile, but I included visual spatial as kind of a bridge between visual and tactile because that is basically where my brain lives. As you may have guessed, based on my auditory processing ranges on the previous slide, I definitely do not favor auditory-only types of learning. I am an extremely visual learner, and I have a very easy time with reading and image comprehension. However, I would say that the vast majority of the cognitive reasoning and hashing out of problems, questions, etc., takes place as like a virtual reality simulation, whereby it feels like I have a 3D silent film playing out in my brain and I'm watching it, but I can also interact with it and flip things around, look at all of the sides, and piece things together and take them apart and tinker with them. It's really fun. There have been so many times I have been caught staring off into nothing and asked what I'm thinking about, and the only answer I can come up with is, I don't know, I was just looking around in my brain. Which leads me into the second half of the slide, which is looking at language production, and that is specifically a massive issue for me. In my case, this is with regard to both spoken and written language, but if I were fluent in sign language, I expect that manual language production would also be impacted based on the way certain types of aphasia present. Honestly, I would be willing to bet that this specific type of neurodevelopmental difference is largely responsible for the autistic experience in differences with social communication and interaction. More on that later. I've labeled this section Novel Language Production Speed because I wanted to highlight the difficulties I experience with producing sentences in contexts where I do not have the subject memorized or rehearsed beforehand. The labels of each panel follow what's typically cited as the 4 steps of language production, which would be conceptualization, or the idea to be shared, formulation, or the process of finding the right words and structuring a sentence that makes sense, articulation, or the ability to direct your mouth parts to make the sounds in the sequence that you want, hopefully with the desired timing, cadence, volume, and emotion. And finally, monitoring, or the process of assessing all of those things and modifying them in real time if necessary. So you can see in my case, I've reported that I generally feel like I have a pretty good grasp on the ideas that I want to share. However, I noticed that my speed in finding the right words and structuring sentences is markedly below average, at least from my observation. Again, that's my speed. I can do it. It's just, it takes me a long time. And that's not always noticeable because, as I mentioned before, this is specifically relating to things I haven't rehearsed. My ability to articulate is fairly variable, but I would say that my baseline cadence is noticeably slower than average, and there are definitely times where I simply cannot get words out of my mouth. As a young, healthy individual, I have been legitimately asked if I am having a stroke. A lot of times. It's kind of sad. However, there are other times, usually when I'm very well rehearsed, where I can sound like one of the most articulate people you've ever met. So that dramatic variability can be really confusing for people to witness, including myself. I would say that my monitoring ability is fairly average to quite good, actually, particularly with writing. And I don't know, maybe that makes it more distressing that I can't speak at times, but whether or not I'm able to actually implement adjustments is totally hit or miss based on what's happening with the previous 2 sliders. For those of you who are familiar with the different types of aphasia, my language production profile is similar to what you would see in someone who has anomic aphasia, Broca's aphasia, and verbal apraxia. I'm not going to be able to go into depth with those comparisons in this video, but that is definitely something on my list for future videos. All right, so now we're getting into the actual autism profile. This slide is just a brief overview of the diagnostic criteria as outlined in the DSM-5, which is the standard of care used in medicine to diagnose the various psychological disorders our society has defined. I do use the conventional terminology on this slide to elucidate what's actually published, at least for right now, so I have those in quotation. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, or DSM-5, was published in 2013 and provides standardized criteria to help diagnose autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. The core criteria are that a person must have persistent deficits in each of 3 areas of social communication and interaction, which are criteria A1 through 3, plus at least 2 of 4 types of restricted repetitive behaviors, which are criteria B1 through 4. The other criteria are C, D, and E must also be met, and then the severity level is depending on how much support is required to manage one's core criteria symptoms. So that's defined as level 1 requires support, level 2 requires substantial support, and level 3 requires very substantial support, which I find very substantially lacking in clarity. Seriously though, I do not really like the order in which these criteria are listed. I'm a bottom-up processor, and I think that the core criteria make way more sense when you get these last few criteria out of the way first. So that's the way I'll go over them for you. We'll look at other first, and then B, and finish off with A. I just wanted to note that this is my first video, and I know it's a ton of information, but I've just been so excited to share all of these ideas with you. So if you find this content valuable or enjoyable and you would like to help my channel grow, please subscribe, comment, and share, and stay tuned for more. So criteria C through E are basically the blanket conditions that rule out a diagnosis of any sort, and here they're applied to autism. Criteria C is that traits must be present in the early developmental period, since they are related to differences in the way the brain develops, but they may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities, or they may be masked by learned strategies later in life. And that's definitely what happened with me, and I would love to tell you about it, but that's a story for another time. Criteria D is literally just the definition of a disorder. So in order to make it into the DSM, which is a manual on mental disorders, you have to meet this criteria of your traits or symptoms having caused clinically significant impairments or limitations in social, emotional, and/or occupational functioning. And I don't know, I personally feel like it's still helpful to define these differences, even if they do not qualify as a disorder, because it helps with understanding and accepting one's authentic self, which then decreases stress rates, and that is far better for your physical and mental health overall. That's why I use the umbrella term of neurodevelopmental spectrum differences, even though many of these profiles may actually be disordered, at least at times. That's just my opinion, and I'm not really sure who's in charge of these things and whether or not they would agree, but that's the approach that I take with my patients, and I know that they are really appreciative of it. Criteria E is that traits are not better explained by an intellectual disability or global developmental delay, so that's just another rule-out criteria. On to criteria B, which requires the presence of restricted and/or repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities that will be manifested by at least 2 of the following 4 areas, currently or by history. The main point that I wanted to emphasize here, and I can't even believe that this is something that has to be said, but the main point is that these patterns are self-soothing. Having a preference for or being comforted by these patterns should not make someone subject to punishment. Sure, the patterns may need to be accommodated or perhaps even adapted if they become harmful in some way, but they should never, ever be demonized. That is just inhumane. And I'm one of those people who hates all or nothing type statements where it's like always or never, but I will say never, ever demonize these behaviors. And I would like to point out the fact that for me and for many other people, the reason these patterns of behavior and the communications that we'll see in criteria A became problematic enough that they've caused clinically significant limitations in my life is because my natural inclinations were punished, and therefore I grew up feeling like I had to mask and I had to hide what made me feel good in order to blend in enough with other people simply to avoid being punished. And this is just such a conundrum that society has created, that your differences don't get to be officially defined, and you don't get to learn about how to support yourself and your needs and become accepting of your idiosyncrasies unless you've become so distressed so as to meet the diagnostic criteria for a disorder. But the only reason those differences would make you feel bad enough to be disordered is because other people made them disordered and treated you like you're the problem and told you that you're bad or you're wrong and you need to do things the right way or else. And it's just backwards. And I'm just like, ugh, Okay, I need to get off that soapbox and move on now. So I'm starting with the bottom here again. Core criteria B4 focuses on the sensory differences seen in most autistic people. I've broken B4 into 2 parts and lumped the second part in with B1, and we'll get to that next. But this first part of B4 is hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input, such as specific sounds, specific colors, light intensity, or repetitive visual stimuli, specific textures like food, clothing, tags, etc., strong smells, light or firm pressure, pain, temperature, or vibration, internal cues such as hunger, thirst, fatigue, urge to urinate or move your bowels, or even understanding emotions, and other internal processes such as heart rate, breathing, digestion, menstruation, etc. Seems familiar, right? It's the sensory profile I already went over with you, and being extremely responsive to or lacking awareness of sensory stimuli is something that is not unique to autism. It's just very commonly seen with autism, which is why I broke it out as being part of the overarching neurodevelopmental spectrum differences. So we have this throwback to the sensory profile scale, and yeah, I am all over the board here. But there are many people who are diagnosed as bipolar or schizophrenic or ADHD or with synesthesia or sensory processing disorder who will also have various differences in these areas. So here we have B1 and the second half of B4, which I lump together because in my opinion, these are all just types of stimming or self-stimulation, which is extremely common among autistics. Again, not unique to us, but perhaps more prevalent in this profile than in some of the others. B1 is stereotyped or repetitive movements, use of objects or speech, which includes nail biting, skin picking, twirling hair, tapping, bouncing, spinning, rocking, flipping objects, hand flapping, etc. I will say that self-harm is technically a form of stimming, similar to skin picking, so things like scratching, biting, cutting, hitting, things like that. It's just that it's become maladaptive in those cases, so those would be the ones that we would want to adapt and redirect so as to avoid injury and protect the overall health of the body. And then echolalia and or repeated use of limited phrases also falls in this category, as does meticulously organizing collections by size, color, type, etc. And then the second half of B4 is unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment, which again, I feel like is just another form of stimming. So the examples that you commonly see here are excessive smelling or touching of objects and visual fascination with lights or movement. That's definitely one of mine. I have my caliper ranges encompassing the entire spectrum for all 4 of these panels because I really do experience extremes in each of these areas. B2 is one of the most pervasive and troublesome aspects of my neurotype, and the one that is the most likely to make me feel disordered. It entails insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior, such as desire to take the same route or eat the same food every day, repeating the same routines with getting ready, greeting people, prepping for exams, etc., difficulty with transitions, especially when they're not self-initiated, rigid thinking patterns, or extreme distress at seemingly insignificant changes or disruptions to one's routines. Transitions are probably the most problematic part. I think that this is why autistic inertia is a thing, if you've ever heard of that concept. Basically, it just means that autistic people have a really hard time transitioning from one state of being to another, even with things like just going from being in bed to getting out of bed, or being dry to getting in the shower, and then being wet in the shower and having to get out of the shower and dry off. It's just, transitions are really hard, okay? I wanted to point out that I have the second panel listed here as a preference for authenticity across all contexts, which is something that I feel stems from this category of patterns. I think it's something that gets me into trouble at times when it comes to social interactions, particularly with honoring social hierarchies, because I simply cannot bring myself to deviate from what I feel is the most honest representation of what I think. And it's not that I don't care about other people's feelings, if I'm not being my most authentic self, I feel like I'm lying. Even if that's not really the case, that's what it feels like. And in my brain, lying and showing respect are mutually exclusive. So this becomes an issue when there's a difference between what I perceive to be a show of respect, which in my brain is being very direct and honest, versus the way an authority over me might expect me to show respect by, I don't even know, my being deferential and passive. I hope this makes sense though. I'm not trying to be annoying or an a-hole, I'm just trying to be respectful. B3 requires highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, such as excessively circumscribed or perseverative interests, some of which may blend in more than others, like with animals or politics or Taylor Swift, but the intensity is still notable, so that's the key word here, or strong attachment or preoccupation with unexpected objects. With co-occurring ADHD, interests may shift more frequently, but again, that same level of intensity is still present. This is known as monotropism, and in my opinion, this is the bread and butter of autism. Don't get me wrong, it is something that can definitely be disordered. It has been for me, at least at times. in the sense that it can impair my ability to attend to my life in healthy ways, such as remembering to feed myself and remembering to sleep. But it's also what allows me to excel in basically anything I become obsessed with. I have a one-track mind, and I need to know why things happen the way that they do and how to extrapolate and grow and build upon what's already known to create something new. And that's why I have bottom-up processing listed here, even though I guess it could be back with the learning style bias section. But I would happily spend every single waking moment completely absorbed in understanding all the little details that pertain to my special interests. Okay, we've made it to core criteria A, which involves differences in social communication and social interactions across multiple contexts in each of the following 3 areas, currently or by history. So A1 revolves around an autistic person's difficulty in intuitively engaging in social and emotional connectivity and reciprocity, which tends to be most noticeable in contexts outside of our special interests or when we're engaging with our neurotypical peers. Examples include unexpected social approach, difficulty with back and forth in conversation, especially with small talk, difficulty engaging and reciprocating in social interactions, especially regarding others' interests, emotions, or affect. So with my sliders here, I have the same sensation and perception panels as I did with my sensory profile before, where sensation is simply the recognition and perception is the multifaceted processing and comprehension speed. But I added performance here as well, which would indicate my ability to actually engage in and reciprocate these behaviors. I broke these out like this because I wanted to highlight that I do notice a difference between my ability to sense that there is some sort of social context for me to understand and engage in, but my processing and comprehension speed with social interaction seems quite delayed relative to the population at large, and that definitely impacts my ability to reciprocate as one would expect. And it's my opinion that my auditory processing delay and language production delay issues massively contribute to the reason that I fall outside of the neurotypical range on both the sensation and perception panels here. Then there's also the matter of whether or not I want to reciprocate, because that may force me outside of my authenticity comfort zone. So just quit it with the small talk, okay? A2 deals with an autistic person's difficulty understanding and or using non-speaking communicative behaviors, such as body language, eye contact, and gesturing, or essentially the ability to read the room and respond to it. But it also describes the difficulty with the modulation of our tone and affect in real time, as well as the tendency for our speech and body language or affect to not really sync up with one another, which can create confusion from the outside looking in because it may seem like we're being disingenuous or bored or annoyed or whatever. Perhaps that's because that's what a neurotypical person being unsynced would indicate, but that is definitely not the case with most autistic people. I have the same 3 panels for this section: sensation, perception, and performance. And as you can see, while my range is perhaps larger than a neurotypical person's might be, I feel like I have a fairly decent grasp on recognizing and understanding this type of communication, but my utilization of non-speaking behaviors is definitely lower than the population average, and my ability to implement modulations to my cadence and affect or sync my speech and my body language definitely leaves a lot to be desired. Again, I partially feel like that is due to choice and not wanting to feel inauthentic, but a major part of this is also related to my language production delays and sensory overwhelm or underwhelm. And by that, I mean I may feel the urge to stim in ways that may be misconstrued as agitation, or I may be too overwhelmed to force myself to make eye contact for an acceptable amount of time. I do want to point out that the way that I've set my ranges here are not the way I naturally developed, but rather the result of my efforts to deliberately study and integrate these into my skill set when I was in college. And I did that in order to facilitate my ability to teach people what I was learning about. I needed to figure out how to get people to listen to me, and not paying attention to them and not knowing what their cues meant was a problem. So these skills are intuitive to me now because I integrated them, similar to the way one would integrate learning to drive a car. And finally, we have A3, which deals with the autistic person's differences in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, or as I have it listed here on the left, cultural and interpersonal conventions and behaviors. Examples include difficulty intuitively adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts, difficulty understanding or adhering to conventional social hierarchies, difficulty making or keeping friends, especially across neurotypes, may lack interest in peers altogether, and difficulties with shared imaginative play or creativity, for example, role-playing or group projects. As I mentioned before, I do struggle quite a bit with comprehending and adhering to social hierarchy expectations, and I believe that's related to my preference for consistency in routines and authenticity, and probably also related to my sensory needs and language production differences. These differences also factor heavily into my difficulties with shared imaginative creativity. All right, so this is just the core criteria A lumped together again with the rainbow background because it's pretty and I like it. I just wanted to point out that when you look at my particular flavor of autism overall, it's not really that surprising that I wasn't diagnosed in childhood, even though I meet every single one of the criteria and then some. Because when you only look at core criteria A, which is what most people focus on, most of my ranges are at least partially overlapping with the neurotypical range, and my most typical states are either barely within or just outside of that range. So I was able to squeeze by, just under the radar, and pass as normal enough that I was ignored or dismissed as lazy or space cadet or pokey, as in slowpoke, which was a nickname that my third grade teacher bestowed upon me and still makes me sick to this day. I've always been very meticulous and thorough. Okay. My fourth grade teacher told my mom that I was at risk of being held back because my reading comprehension was poor, even though I was already reading at a 10th grade level by that point, and the only measurement she used for her determination was my inability to give her an oral summary of a blurb that she had me read aloud to her, while she repeatedly interrupted me to shush the class. In fairness, I also want to note that I had some wonderful teachers as well. My 6th grade teacher was astonished that I'd never been gate tested, and she did an excellent job of fostering my interest in her lessons. And in high school, my sophomore English teacher, Ms. Lapidus, was one of the most understanding and accepting teachers I have ever had. And when I was unable to complete and turn in my final book report because I couldn't fathom presenting it to the class, but the only thing that I was able to come up with is, I don't know, and I was crying. Instead of failing me, she gave me an extension and let me present a month later to a summer school class. I TA'd for her the following 2 years, and I still think about her and her kindness toward me all the time. I have been incredibly blessed in my life. I had a loving family who accepted me just the way I was, probably because they're all neurodivergent as well. And I have been able to excel despite, or perhaps even because of my differences. But I know that I would have been able to thrive so much more throughout my childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood if I had always been offered the type of acceptance and support that Ms. Lapidus bestowed upon me, or the type of accommodations that I now regularly make for myself. That acceptance, those adaptations, should have been offered to me before my differences became symptoms. Symptoms that made me feel like I must actually be a robot or an alien. Symptoms that prompted me to meticulously hone my generalized anxiety in order to ensure that I could blend in with my peers enough to avoid notice. Symptoms that inevitably caused me to become disordered and even disabled at times. Please don't get me wrong, I do not harbor any malice over my upbringing, especially not towards my parents who did the best that they could with what they had been taught at the time. Mine is an overwhelmingly happy story overall. But there are so many people where that is sadly not the case, and it's my aim to join the neurodivergent fray in fostering understanding and change. So, it is my obviously biased and yet still professional opinion that defining and accepting all of these neurodevelopmental differences before they become significantly disordered is one of the best approaches we can take to help improve the mental health and consequently the physical health of our society as a whole. Final thoughts here. I personally think that the category of autoimmune diseases could be considered its own profile within the neurodevelopmental spectrum differences umbrella, not just something that is frequently a comorbidity. Because what immune system would intentionally start attacking its own healthy tissue for seemingly no good reason? My theory is that it would be the ones that are outliers on a normal distribution curve. And immune-mediated responses are heavily influenced by our autonomic nervous system, right? What are your thoughts? Let me know. I will say that approaching my patients who have autoimmune diseases with a neurodiversity-affirming perspective has been extremely beneficial for them based on the feedback I've gotten. And I do not approach their treatment any differently otherwise. I offer them evidence-based recommendations. But from what I've observed, the psychological component, the validation and acceptance portion, makes a huge impact on their quality of life overall, their personal empowerment, and their symptom control. If you are still with me all the way to the slide, holy crap, thank you so much. Please leave a rainbow in the comments to let me know that you did, and I would love to hear about how this relates to your life, what you learned or what ideas you would build on, and what you would like to see next from me. I'll do my best to respond to as many comments as I can. I just wanted to note that my brother made this scale into an adjustable program, so you can just click and drag all the sliders wherever you'd like. So that's really exciting. We'll be working to get that online for anyone to use to show off your flavor of neurodivergence. I'll link the details in the description once we have that ready. Keep learning, my friend. I will see you next time.